I still had the grease from my second job under my fingernails when my foster mother, Linda, slapped the final eviction notice into my wet palm. "Your rent was due at noon, Kate," she sneered, her voice colder than the storm. "We're running a household, not a charity." Behind her, Richard stood like a stone statue as my single bag was tossed into the rising mud. I was Kate Johnson, to the government, a daughter in need of care. To the Harrisons, I was just a paycheck that had finally stopped clearing. I thought the freezing rain would be the last thing I ever felt as my legs finally gave out on the wet asphalt. But then, the blinding headlights of a black sedan cut through the midnight fog. I didn't know then that the man behind the wheel was Kim Taesung, a man whose name made the city's elite tremble in their silk sheets. He didn't just give me a hospital bed, he gave me the weapons to take back my life. If you're ready to see what happens when a greedy family realizes they've just evicted their new landlord, hit that subscribe button. Hello, family. We all know that life isn't always fair, but on this channel we make sure the ledger always balances. Today, we're following a journey from the freezing rain to the height of power. If you believe that no one should ever be treated like a paycheck, you're in the right place. To my longtime subscribers, thank you for riding with me. Now, let's watch the tables turn. The rain didn't just fall that night. It felt like the world was trying to scrub my existence off the pavement. As I stood there, watching the red taillights of the Harrisons' car fade into the gray mist, the physical cold was nothing compared to the hollow ache of the betrayal. I looked down at the single garbage bag at my feet, containing the few remnants of a life that had been systematically dismantled for profit. My mind, perhaps as a defense against the freezing wind, retreated into the past. Back to the day, the safety of the Harrison home first began to feel like a high-interest loan I could never repay. It had started almost immediately after the social worker's car pulled away 3 years ago. Linda Harrison hadn't hugged me or offered a glass of water. Instead, she had handed me a laminated sheet of paper. It was a house policy list, but to me, it was a menu of my own exploitation. Every month, the government sent the Harrisons a stipend for my care, and several NGOs contributed additional funds to ensure I had everything a grieving orphan might need to heal. But the Harrisons viewed that money as their baseline salary, and my presence as a secondary revenue stream. I remembered a Tuesday during my first month there. I had reached for a second glass of orange juice at breakfast. Richard's hand had clamped over my wrist, his grip like a dull vice. He didn't look at me with anger, but with a terrifying, calculated boredom. "Orange juice is for paying guests, Kate," he had muttered, tapping a small ledger he kept next to the toaster. "That's an extra 50 cents for the poor, plus the refrigeration tax. Add it to her tab, Linda." Linda didn't even look up from her phone, where she was browsing a website for designer tennis bracelets. She just gave a sharp, affirmative nod. By the end of that first year, I wasn't a ward. I was a tenant in a prison I was forced to fund. They charged me room maintenance fees for a closet-sized space with a leaking ceiling. They charged me for the Wi-Fi I needed to do my schoolwork, calling it a technology access premium. When the winter months hit, Richard added a heating surcharge to my monthly bill, despite the fact that he kept the thermostat so low I had to sleep in my coat. I worked 3 jobs, scrubbing floors at a local diner, walking dogs until my shoes wore thin, and stocking shelves until midnight, just to hand every cent over to them. The most bitter part was the contrast. I would walk into the living room to hand Richard my crumpled tips, only to see Linda draped in a new gold necklace or flaunting a silk scarf that cost more than my monthly rent. I knew where that money came from. It came from the checks meant for my clothes, my therapy, and my future. They were literally wearing my survival on their necks. One afternoon, I saw a letter from an NGO on the counter, thanking the Harrisons for their selfless dedication to my well-being. Next to it sat a receipt for a new set of golf clubs Richard had bought that morning. "Why do you do this?" I had asked once, my voice trembling with a rare moment of defiance. "The government already pays you to take care of me." Richard had looked at me with those small, calculating eyes, a sliver of a smile touching his thin lips. "They pay us to keep you alive, Kate. If you want to live well, that's on your own dime. Consider it a lesson in the real world. Nobody gets a free ride." He called it a lesson, but it was a theft of my humanity. Every meal I ate felt like ash in my mouth, because I knew exactly how many hours of scrubbing floors it cost me. I became an expert at making myself small, at breathing quietly so they wouldn't find a way to charge me for the oxygen. I lived in a constant state of mathematical anxiety, forever calculating the cost of a shower or the price of a light bulb burning for an hour. Then came the day the restaurant closed. It was a sudden, quiet death for the small business, but for me, it was a death sentence. I sat at the kitchen table that evening, my heart hammering against my ribs, and explained to Richard that I would be $50 short on the room fee this month. I promised to find a new job by Monday. I promised to work double shifts. Richard didn't yell. He didn't even look disappointed. He simply stood up and walked to the door, beckoning Linda to follow. "We discussed this, Kate," he said, his voice flat and clinical. "The Harrison household doesn't carry bad debt. If the ledger doesn't balance, the account is closed." And just like that, the real-world lesson reached its final chapter. They didn't see the girl who had spent 3 years making them rich. They saw a broken ATM. As Linda pushed me toward the door, I caught the glint of the diamond earrings she had bought with my last utility payment. They sparkled in the hallway light, a cruel mockery of the life they had stolen from me. Now, lying on the wet asphalt as the darkness began to pull at the edges of my vision, those memories were the only things keeping me cold. I expected the end to be silent. I expected to simply become another debit on the world's balance sheet. But then, the headlights cut through the fog, not the dull, yellow lights of a foster parent's sedan, but a piercing, surgical white. A car stopped, the engine a low, powerful growl that seemed to vibrate through the pavement and into my very bones. Through the haze of the rain, I saw a door open. A pair of polished leather shoes stepped onto the street, oblivious to the mud. A man knelt beside me, his presence so heavy and commanding that the storm itself seemed to shy away from him. He didn't look at me with the greed of the Harrisons or the indifference of the city. His eyes were intense, focused, and filled with a quiet, terrifying authority. "Bring her into the car," he said. The voice wasn't a request. It was an edit to the laws of the universe. As I was lifted into the warmth of the leather interior, away from the ledger of blood, and the people who thought I was a paycheck, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in 3 years. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was the realization that the Harrisons had made a fatal mistake in their calculations. They thought I had nothing left to give. They didn't realize that by throwing me into the storm, they had handed me to the one man who could make them pay back every cent with interest. The transition from the freezing pavement to the hospital of silence was not a sudden awakening, but a slow, drifting ascent through layers of clinical white. I didn't wake up to the sound of Richard's heavy footsteps or the sharp, impatient tapping of Linda's fingernails on the kitchen counter. Instead, there was only the rhythmic, steady hum of a heart monitor, a sound that, for the first time in 3 years, didn't cost me a cent to hear. The air was thick with the scent of sterile linen and expensive sandalwood, a combination that felt heavy and protective, like a physical barrier between me and the world that had just tried to drown me. When my eyes finally fluttered open, the light didn't sting. It was soft and recessed, illuminating a room that looked more like a 5-star hotel suite than a hospital wing. The windows were floor to ceiling, showing the city skyline blurred by the remaining morning mist, but I could tell from the height that I was somewhere the Harrisons could never reach. There were no house policy signs on these walls. There were no ledgers. I tried to sit up, but a wave of exhaustion pinned me back to the silk-soft pillows. My long braids had been cleaned and dried, fanned out across the bed like dark silk. My skin, which had felt like it was bruising under the force of the rain, was now warm. That was when I noticed the man sitting in the armchair by the window. Kim Taesung didn't look like a savior. He looked like an architect of a world I didn't understand. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that fit his broad shoulders with surgical precision, his white shirt crisp and untouched by the chaos of the city outside. He wasn't looking at a phone or a newspaper. He was simply watching me with eyes that were terrifyingly still. They were the eyes of a man who had seen everything and was unimpressed by most of it. Behind him, 2 men in identical black suits stood like shadows near the door, silent, disciplined, and alert. They weren't just security, they were a statement of power. "You've slept for 14 hours, he said. His voice was deep, a low resonance that seemed to vibrate in the quiet room. It carried no pity, only a cold, observant weight. The doctors say your body was in shock, not just from the cold, but from years of, let's call it prolonged stress. I pulled the duvet tighter around my chest, a reflexive gesture of the girl who had learned to hide her needs. Who are you? I whispered, my voice raspy and thin. How did I get here? I don't have the insurance for a place like this. I can't pay you back. The corner of T-Sung's mouth didn't move, but his eyes darkened with a flick of something that looked like controlled rage. He stood up, his movements fluid and predatory, and walked toward the edge of the bed. He didn't tower over me. He simply occupied the space with an authority that made the room feel smaller. Insurance is a concern for people who live by other people's rules, he replied, his gaze locked onto mine. In this wing, my rules are the only ones that matter, and my first rule is that you stop talking about debt. He pulled a thin, leather-bound folder from the bedside table. I recognized the logos on the top, the government agency that handled my foster placement and the NGO that had supposedly been my lifeline. He flipped through the pages with a slow, deliberate rhythm that felt like a countdown. I spent the night looking into your life, Kate Johnson, he said, his voice dropping an octave. I saw the stipends. I saw the donations. I saw the bank accounts where that money disappeared the moment it hit Richard Harrison's name. I also saw the reports you never filed, the ones where you worked 40 hours a week at a diner while being a full-time student, only to have your earnings vanish into a rent, fund for a house you were legally entitled to live in for free. I looked away, the shame of my exploitation rising in my throat like bile. They told me it was a lesson. They said they were the only ones who took me in, that I owed them for the roof over my head. T-Sung stepped closer, leaning in until I could smell the sandalwood and the cold steel of his presence. He reached out, not to touch me, but to tap the folder with a blunt, powerful finger. They didn't take you in. They harvested you. He went silent for a moment, the quiet in the room so absolute that the hum of the heart monitor felt like a shout. Then, he asked the question that shattered the last of my defenses. It wasn't about the rain or the accident that killed my parents. Tell me, Kate, he said, his eyes piercing through my forced composure. In those 3 years, how much did they charge you to be a daughter? The question hit me harder than the cold of the storm ever could. I thought of the 50-cent orange juice. I thought of the Wi-Fi fees and the heating surcharges. I thought of the thousands of dollars I had scrubbed out of floors and handed over to people who wore my survival as jewelry. Everything, I choked out, the tears finally breaking through. They charged me everything I had, and when I had nothing left, they threw me away. T-Sung didn't offer a tissue. He didn't offer a hollow, it's okay. Instead, he straightened his suit jacket and looked toward the men at the door. Richard and Linda Harrison believe they are experts in debt, he said, turning back to me. They believe that because you are young and alone, you are a liability they can simply write off. He leaned down again, his face a mask of terrifying resolve. They are about to learn that I am much better at math than they are, and by the time I am finished, they will realize that the debt they owe you has gathered a lifetime of interest. For the first time since my parents died, I didn't feel like a paycheck. I felt like a catalyst. As T-Sung turned to leave the room, his black coat billowing behind him like a dark wing, I realized that the hospital of silence wasn't just a place for me to heal. It was the place where my silence ended and his war began. The clinical stillness of the hospital wing was broken only by the rhythmic, muted tapping of a keyboard. I watched from the bed as 2 of T-Sung's men who looked like they were built of granite and shadows, hunched over high-end laptops in the corner of the room. They weren't doctors, but they were performing a surgery of a different kind. They were dissecting the financial life of Richard and Linda Harrison, peeling back the layers of respectable foster care to reveal the rot underneath. Kim T-Sung stood by the window, his back to me, his silhouette cutting a sharp, dark line against the morning light. He hadn't spoken for an hour, but the air around him felt charged, like the static before a lightning strike. Every few minutes, one of the men would murmur a string of numbers or a bank routing code, and I would see T-Sung's shoulders tighten. He wasn't just listening to data, he was tallying the cost of my suffering. Found it, boss, one of the men said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. The Hope for Orphans NGO. They've been sending monthly checks for 3 years. It's not just the basic stipend. There were special grants for trauma counseling and extracurricular development, totaling over $40,000 from that source alone. T-Sung turned slowly, his face a mask of cold, focused intensity. And where did that money go, Gyro? Directly into a private offshore account, boss, registered to a shell company called Harrison Living Trust. It was never touched for Kate's needs, not once. Instead, we see a withdrawal for the same amount at a luxury car dealership the week after the first grant cleared. I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. I remembered that week. I had been forced to walk to school in a blizzard because the Harrisons told me they couldn't afford the gas to drive me, and my transportation allowance had been cut by the state. Meanwhile, Richard had pulled into the driveway in a gleaming new SUV, claiming he had won it in a lucky trade. He had looked me in the eye and told me to be grateful he could even afford the insurance to keep it. The second investigator spoke up, his eyes never leaving the screen. It gets worse. We've cross-referenced the government's direct deposit records with the rent receipts Kate was forced to sign. They were double-dipping. They collected $1,800 a month from the state, then charged her $600 a month for a service fee. Over 3 years, including the stolen NGO funds and her own confiscated wages, they've effectively diverted $112,000 into their own pockets. The silence that followed was suffocating. $112,000. To the Harrisons, it was a fortune built on high-interest jewelry and weekend getaways. To me, it was the price of every meal I had skipped, every hour of sleep I had lost scrubbing floors, and every night I had spent shivering under a thin blanket. It was the price of my parents' memory, sold to the highest bidder by people who were supposed to be my guardians. T-Sung walked to the foot of my bed. He didn't look at the files, he looked at me. His eyes were no longer just observant, they were predatory. "Do you understand what they did, Kate?" he asked, his voice a low, vibrating growl. "They didn't just take your money, they stole your time. They stole the years you were supposed to be healing and turned them into a business model." I knew they were greedy," I whispered, my voice breaking. "But I didn't know it was that much. I thought I was lucky they kept me. They told me no one else wanted a girl with so much baggage." T-Sung slammed his hand down on the footboard of the bed, a single, sharp crack that made me flit. "They lied to keep the faucet running. You weren't baggage to them. You were a gold mine." He turned back to his men, his voice dropping into a tone of command that made my blood run cold. "Prepare the audit of souls." "I don't want them arrested. Not yet. Arresting them is a mercy the law provides. I want them to watch their empire of glass shatter from the inside out." "What are you going to do?" I asked, a mix of fear and hope rising in my chest. T-Sung adjusted his cufflinks, a gesture of terrifying calm. "Richard Harrison likes to play the businessman. He likes to talk about debt and balance sheets." "Very well. We will play his game. By tonight, every cent of that $100,000 will be flagged for investigation. Their credit will be ash. Their reputation will be a toxic waste site. And the house they think they own, it's already beginning to disappear under their feet." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over me like a protective shroud. "They threw you out into a storm because you were $50 short, Kate. They are about to find out what happens when the bill for $100,000 finally comes due. And I am the one who has come to collect." As he walked out of the room, followed by his silent sentinels, I realized that the man who had found me in the rain wasn't just a savior. He was the reckoning. The Harrisons had spent 3 years writing a ledger of blood and greed, never imagining that someone like Kim T-Sung would ever bother to read the fine print. But he had read it, and now he was going to rewrite the ending. The warmth of the hospital suite began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a war room. As my strength returned, I watched the transition of Kim T-Sung from a silent rescuer into a meticulous architect of ruin. He didn't believe in the loud, messy justice of sirens and handcuffs. At least, not yet. He believed in the slow, suffocating pressure of a trap, closing so quietly the prey doesn't realize they're caught until they try to breathe. "The law is a blunt instrument, Kate," T-Sung said, standing over a mahogany table covered in property deeds and bank notices. "If I call the police now, they will spend years in court. They will use the money they stole from you to hire expensive lawyers. They might even win on a technicality. But the market has no mercy for those who cannot pay." He gestured to a document with a golden seal. It was the deed to the Harrisons' suburban home, the house where I had scrubbed floors and slept in a freezing closet. I recognized the address, but the owner's name was a string of letters I didn't know. Aegis Holdings Group. Richard Harrison believes he is a master of property because he charges an orphan rent, T-Sung continued, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous resonance. He doesn't realize that his mortgage was bundled and sold to a secondary lender 3 months ago. And yesterday, Aegis Holdings, my company, purchased that debt in full. I didn't just buy a contract, Kate. I bought their shelter. I looked at the paper, a strange shiver of power and fear running through me. So, you're their landlord now. In every way that matters, he replied, a shadow of a smile touching his intense eyes. They think they are safe in their fortress of greed. They are currently planning a celebration dinner for the extra profit they made by casting you out. They have no idea that every breath they take inside those walls now belongs to me. Every light they turn on, every drop of water they use, it is being logged. And I am about to increase the cost of their existence. T-Sung's investigators, Gyro and the others, worked in the background like silent ghosts. They weren't just watching the house, they were dismantling the Harrisons' social standing. They leaked anonymized tips to the local country club about Richard's unstable financial ventures. They triggered routine audits of Linda's charity accounts. It was a silent siege, an invisible perimeter established around the people who thought they were untouchable. I remembered how Linda used to gloat about the security of their life, how she would mock the homeless people we saw on the news as failures of character. She didn't realize that her own character was being weighed on a scale she couldn't see, and she was found wanting. Why not just kick them out today? I asked, my voice gaining a strength I hadn't felt in years. Why wait? T-Sung walked over to me, his presence heavy and commanding. He reached out, straightening the collar of the silk robe his staff had provided for me. Because, Kate, the most painful part of losing everything isn't the fall, it's the anticipation. I want them to feel the walls closing in. I want them to experience the same mathematical anxiety they forced on you. I want them to check their bank balance and see a zero. I want them to reach for a door and find it locked by a hand they cannot see. He turned back to the window, looking out over the city as if he already owned every street. By the end of the week, the Harrisons will realize that they aren't the masters of their domain. They are merely tenants in a house of cards, and when the wind finally blows, I want you to be the one who stands at the door. The siege had begun. It wasn't fought with bullets or blades, but with interest rates, foreclosure notices, and the cold, hard logic of a man who knew that the best way to destroy a parasite was to take away the host. As I watched T-Sung command his empire, I realized that the ledger of blood was being balanced, cent by cent, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who had to worry about the cost. The air in the high-end boutique was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the quiet, rhythmic clicking of credit cards, a sound that had always been Linda Harrison's favorite symphony. She stood at the marble counter, her chin tilted upward with that practiced air of superiority I knew so well. In front of her sat a structured leather handbag, its gold hardware gleaming under the recessed lighting like the jewelry she had bought with my stolen NGO funds. She was dressed in a soft cashmere coat, her hair perfectly coiffed, looking every bit the charitable matriarch she pretended to be. "I'll take the matching wallet as well," Linda said, her voice a silk-wrapped command. She slid her gold-plated credit card across the counter with a flourish, the same hand that had slapped the house keys out of my palm just days ago. From the silent observation of Kim T-Sung's black sedan parked across the street, I watched her through the tinted glass. Beside me, T-Sung sat with his laptop open, his fingers dancing across the keys with a cold, predatory focus. He had spent the morning weaving a digital net around the Harrisons, and now it was time to pull the cord. "She's about to realize that her credit isn't the only thing that's expired," T-Sung murmured, his voice a low, vibrating hum of anticipation. Inside the boutique, the sales associate swiped the card. A pause followed, then another. The associate's polite smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of professional confusion. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Harrison, but the transaction was declined. Perhaps there's an issue with the chip." Linda laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed off the glass displays. "Don't be ridiculous. Try it again. It must be your machine. I just used that card this morning." The associate swiped it again, Then a third time. Each time, the red light on the terminal blinked like a warning signal. Linda's face began to flush, a blotchy red creeping up her neck, the same look she gave me when I was 50 cents short on the refrigeration tax. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out a second card, then a third. One by one, they were fed into the machine. One by one, they were rejected. Declined, the associate said, her voice dropping into a tone that was no longer subservient. In fact, the system is flagging these accounts as under review. I'm afraid I can't process any of these. Linda's composure shattered. This is an outrage. Do you have any idea who I am? My husband handles some of the most prestigious accounts in this city. She reached for her phone to call Richard, her fingers trembling with a mix of fury and a sudden, cold seed of panic. She didn't know that Richard was currently sitting in his home office, staring at a computer screen where every Harrison Living Trust account was grayed out, locked behind a flashing red banner that read, "Federal investigation pending, funds frozen." T-Sung closed his laptop with a quiet, final click. The audit of souls has officially reached the government agencies, Kate. The tips I leaked weren't just rumors. They were corroborated by the paper trail my team reconstructed. The state has flagged every cent of the Guardian funds they've collected for you over the last 3 years. The NGO has filed a preliminary fraud report. As of 10 minutes ago, Richard and Linda Harrison are worth exactly $0. Through the boutique window, I saw Linda frantically trying to make a call. But her face grew pale as she stared at her phone's screen. T-Sung had even severed her cellular service, part of the technological access premium. He was now charging her in reverse. She looked small, panicked, and suddenly very old. She looked exactly the way I felt the night she pushed me into the rain. "They'll be getting a knock on the door soon," T-Sung said, his eyes fixed on the boutique. "Not from the police, but from the state auditors. They're going to ask for receipts for 3 years of extracurricular development and trauma counseling. They're going to ask why their ward was working 40 hours a week at a diner while they were buying Italian leather." Linda hurried out of the store, her head down, the expensive handbag left behind on the counter like a forgotten dream. She stumbled toward her car, but as she reached for the handle, she found it wouldn't nudge. The high-end SUV, purchased with my transportation allowance, had been remotely immobilized. She stood in the parking lot, clutching her cheap jewelry, looking around as if the very air had turned against her. "They thought the storm was over once the door was locked," I whispered, watching my foster mother realize she was stranded in a world that no longer recognized her status. T-Sung turned the key in the ignition, the engine of the Genesis purring like a beast that had just finished its first meal. "The storm is only just beginning, Kate. They've lost their money. Now they're about to lose their sanctuary." As we pulled away, I didn't feel the rush of joy I expected. Instead, I felt a deep, quiet settling in my bones. The Harrisons had spent 3 years treating me like a bad debt. Now, the interest had finally eclipsed the principal, and they were finding out that in Kim T-Sung's world, there was no such thing as a bankruptcy that didn't cost you your soul. The hospital room was no longer a place of recovery. It had become a dressing room for a premiere I hadn't yet realized I was starring in. A row of rolling racks had been brought in, draped in garment bags that hummed with the silent prestige of designers whose names I had only ever seen in the magazines Linda used to leave on the coffee table. The ones she'd charge me a subscription usage fee, just to glance at. Kim T-Sung stood by the window, his back to the room, his reflection mirrored in the glass. He didn't look at the clothes. He looked at the city, his hands clasped behind his back in that way that made him look like he was surveying a battlefield he had already conquered. "The Harrisons didn't just steal your money, Kate," he said, his voice cutting through the rustle of silk as a stylist moved a gown. "They stole your image. They dressed you in the clothes of a victim so that whenever you looked in a mirror, you would see someone who was lucky to be fed. They wanted you to look small so you would act small." He turned around, his intense, dark eyes scanning me with a clinical precision. I felt exposed in the simple hospital robe, my long braids pulled back, my skin still pale from the exhaustion of the storm. "Today," he continued, stepping toward a rack of structured blazers and charcoal-toned silks, "we change the reflection. You are no longer the girl who cleans their floors. You are the woman who owns the foundation they stand on." He pulled out a deep emerald silk blouse and a pair of tailored black trousers. The fabric was so light it felt like water against my skin. "Dress," he commanded softly. "And remember, expensive clothing isn't a costume, it's armor. When you walk into that house, I don't want them to see a foster daughter. I want them to see their replacement." As I changed behind the screen, I felt the shift. For 3 years, I had worn oversized hoodies to hide my frame and worn-out sneakers that squeaked on the linoleum. Now, the silk slid over my shoulders like a second skin. The trousers fit with a mathematical perfection, elongating my legs and forcing my posture to straighten. When I stepped out, T-Sung was waiting with a pair of black stiletto heels. "Put them on," he said. I hesitated. I usually wear flats for work for the diner." "The diner is dead, Kate," he said, his voice dropping into that low, magnetic resonance. "In these, you are taller than Richard. You look down at him, not up. In these, every step you take sounds like a heartbeat skipping in his chest. That is the look of power. It is the ability to command a room before you even open your mouth." I stepped into the shoes, feeling the sudden height, the precarious but exhilarating shift in my center of gravity. I walked toward the full-length mirror, and for a moment I didn't recognize the woman looking back. My deep brown skin glowed against the emerald silk. My braids, which had always felt like a burden to maintain between shifts, now looked like a crown of obsidian. My facial features, once soft with grief, were sharpened by the high-waisted cut of the trousers. I looked expensive. I looked dangerous. T-Sung walked up behind me, his reflection towering over mine. He placed a heavy, cold weight around my neck, a gold chain with a single, flawless emerald pendant that matched the blouse. It was the kind of jewelry Linda would have killed for, the kind she spent my NGO grants trying to emulate with her cheap-up-close trinkets. "Look at yourself," T-Sung whispered, his hands resting lightly on my shoulders. "Richard Harrison thinks he knows you. He thinks he can predict your silence. But when he sees this woman, he will realize he never knew you at all. He only knew the ghost he tried to create." I stared at my reflection, my heart hammering a new rhythm, one of cold, rising confidence. I remembered the feeling of the rain, the smell of the mud, and the sound of the deadbolt. Those memories were still there, but they were no longer heavy. They were the fuel. "Power isn't just about the money in your account, Kate," T-Sung said, his gaze meeting mine in the mirror. "It is the refusal to be intimidated by people who are beneath you. The Harrisons are beneath you. They always were. They just used your kindness to keep you on your knees." He reached out and tilted my chin up, mirroring the way Linda used to do when she was judging my performance as a daughter. But his touch wasn't condescending. It was a calibration. "Keep your chin at this angle," he instructed. "Do not blink when they shout. Do not explain yourself when they ask questions. A queen does not explain her presence to the subjects she is about to evict." He stepped back, nodding to his bodyguards. One of them stepped forward, handing me a slim, leather briefcase. Inside were the deeds, the frozen account notices, and the final eviction papers, the paper-cut raid that would end the Harrisons' reign. "You are ready," T-Sung said, his eyes filled with a dark, satisfied pride. "The car is waiting. The house is officially yours. Now go and show them exactly what the rent they charged you actually bought." As I walked out of the hospital wing, the click of my heels echoing against the marble floor, I realized that the lesson in class was the most important one I'd ever learned. It wasn't about the price of the silk or the carat of the stone. It was about the moment I stopped looking for a home and started realizing I was the one who owned the keys. The silence inside the Harrison house was thick and suffocating, a stark contrast to the lively, arrogant atmosphere that usually filled its halls. Richard sat at the heavy oak dining table, the one he'd bought with the extra maintenance fees he'd squeezed out of me, staring at a stack of red-stamped notices that had been hand-delivered by a man in a suit who refused to speak. Linda stood by the window, her fingers twitching at the hem of her expensive house dress, her face pale and blotchy. The local boutique incident had been the first crack in the dam, but this morning, the dam had completely burst. "It has to be a mistake, Richard," Linda whispered, her voice trembling. "How can we be evicted from our own home? We've lived here for 15 years. We are respectable people." Richard didn't answer. He was staring at the bold, black lettering at the top of the document, notice of immediate possession. Below it, the cold, clinical language of the law explained that the mortgage had been defaulted upon due to irregularities in declared income and seizure of assets by state investigators. The new owner, Aegis Holdings Group, was exercising its right to terminate their residency effective in 24 hours. Non-payment of rent, Richard finally choked out, slamming his fist onto the table. I don't pay rent. I'm the one who collects it. Who the hell is Aegis Holdings? I've called every contact I have at the bank and they all say the same thing. The file is restricted. It's like we've been erased from the system. He reached for the letter again, his eyes scanning the secondary charge: systemic fraud and misappropriation of Guardian funds. The state audit hadn't just frozen their bank accounts. It had turned their entire financial history into a crime scene. Every convenience fee they'd charged me, every NGO dollar they'd diverted into Linda's jewelry box, was now being used as a legal crowbar to pry them out of the house. We have nowhere to go, Richard, Linda wailed, her eyes darting around the room at the mahogany furniture and the silver tea sets. Everything we have is tied up in this house. If they take this, we're like those people on the street, like that girl. At the mention of that girl, a heavy silence fell over them. For 3 years, they had used me as a benchmark for their own success. As long as I was struggling, they were thriving. As long as I was paying them to survive, they were the masters of their universe. Now, the roles were shifting in a way they couldn't comprehend. A sudden, sharp knock at the door made them both jump. Richard stood up, his face hardening into a mask of false bravado. It's probably the lawyers. I'll handle this, Linda. I'll tell them who we are. But when he opened the door, it wasn't a lawyer. It was a man in a black suit with a silent, disciplined posture, one of Kim Tae-sung's shadows. He didn't say a word. He simply handed Richard a final, laminated document and stepped back, clearing the way for a black Genesis that was pulling into the driveway. The car moved with a predatory grace, its engine a low, menacing hum that seemed to vibrate the very air. Richard and Linda stood on the porch, squinting against the glare of the morning sun reflecting off the polished chrome. They looked small, huddled together in the shadow of the house they no longer owned. Is that him? Linda whispered, clutching Richard's arm. Is that the owner? The back door of the car opened, and a pair of black stiletto heels stepped onto the pavement. The click was sharp, rhythmic, and filled with a terrifying authority. Then a woman stepped out, her deep emerald silk blouse catching the light, her long obsidian braids draped over her shoulders like a crown. She didn't look like a tenant. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like the storm had finally taken a human shape. As I walked toward the porch, my chin tilted at the precise angle Tae-sung had taught me. I saw the exact moment the realization hit them. I saw Richard's jaw drop and Linda's hand move to her throat, reaching for the gold necklace that was no longer there, the one the auditors had taken that morning. Kate, Richard gasped, his voice cracking. What? What is this? Where did you get those clothes? What are you doing in that car? I didn't blink. I didn't stop until I was standing on the top step, looking down at them from the height of my heels. The look of power wasn't just a costume. It was a cold, hard reality that settled into my bones. The house policy has changed, Richard, I said, my voice steady and devoid of the fear that had defined my life for 3 years. And as of this morning, your account is officially closed. Behind me, the car door opened again, and Kim Tae-sung stepped out, his presence filling the driveway like a dark, immovable mountain. He didn't speak to them. He didn't even look at them. He simply walked to my side and placed a hand on the small of my back, a gesture of ownership and protection that silenced the Harrisons more effectively than any shout ever could. The 24 hours start now, I said, handing Richard the final notice. I suggest you start packing, but remember, the luggage was bought with my money, so you'll be leaving with exactly what you gave me when you pushed me into the rain. I turned my back on them and walked into the house, the sound of my heels echoing through the foyer like a heartbeat. For the first time, the house didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a debt that had finally, mercifully, been settled in full. The interior of the Harrison house felt different, colder, yet cleaner, as if the very air was purging itself of the 3 years of parasitic greed that had settled into the floorboards. I stood in the center of the living room, my heels resting on the plush rug that my own wages had helped pay for. Behind me, Kim Tae-sung stood near the fireplace, a silent, dark pillar of strength. He didn't say a word. He simply watched me with those intense, focused eyes, granting me the space to settle the debt that had nearly cost me my life. Outside, the sound of the front door creaking open signaled the return of the defeated. Richard and Linda stumbled into the foyer, their faces haggard and their clothes rumpled from a night of panicked, fruitless phone calls. They looked like ghosts haunting a house that had already forgotten their names. They hadn't seen me yet. I was positioned in the shadow of the hallway, a dark silhouette against the morning light. "We have to talk to the owner, Richard," Linda was sobbing, her voice a thin, ragged edge of its former self. "There has to be a mistake. We can't be out by noon. We have nowhere to go. No friends, no family. The bank won't even let us open a savings account." Richard leaned heavily against the mahogany banister, his shoulders slumped. Gone was the arrogant master of the house who used to tap his ledger with a boredom that masked his cruelty. "I'll beg if I have to, Linda," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'll tell them we'll pay double. I'll tell them we'll do whatever they want. We just need a roof." He looked toward the living room, his eyes squinting into the shadows. "Hello, is someone there? Please, we received the notice. We just need to speak to the person in charge. We're good people. We've been pillars of this community. We just need a little mercy." I stepped out of the shadows then, the emerald silk of my blouse catching the light like a warning flare. The look of power Tae-sung had taught me wasn't a mask anymore. It was a skin. I didn't rush. I walked with a slow, rhythmic grace, the click of my heels against the hardwood sounding like a gavel bringing a courtroom to order. Linda let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Richard froze, his eyes bulging as he took in the transformation. They looked at my tailored trousers, the gold pendant resting against my collarbone, and the cold, unyielding fire in my eyes. They looked for the girl who had fainted in the rain, but she wasn't there. "Kate," Richard breathed, his voice a mixture of confusion and a sudden, terrifying hope. "Kate, thank God, you're with the new owners. You have to tell them, Kate. You have to tell them how much we did for you. Tell them we're family. Help us stay." Linda rushed forward, her hands reaching out to grab my sleeves, but a sharp, silent movement from one of Tae-sung's bodyguards made her flinch back. "Kate, please," she wailed, the tears carving tracks through her expensive makeup. "We're sorry about the other night. We were stressed. The money, we can work it out. You can have your room back. We won't charge you for the Wi-Fi. Just tell your benefactor to let us stay." I looked at them, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of the old pity. But then I remembered the 50-cent orange juice. I remembered the refrigeration tax and the heating surcharges. I remembered the sound of the deadbolt clicking shut while I stood shivering in a storm that should have killed me. "Family?" I asked, my voice low and steady, vibrating with the authority of someone who finally knew their worth. "Is that what you call a ledger of blood, Richard? Is that what you call stealing $100,000 from a grieving orphan while she scrubs floors to pay for the air she breathes?" I walked toward the dining table, the same table where Richard used to calculate my debt. I picked up the eviction notice he had dropped. "You talked a lot about the real world, Richard. You told me that business was business, and that if the ledger didn't balance, the account had to be closed." "We were teaching you," Linda cried out, her voice desperate. "We were preparing you." "No," I said, my gaze cutting through her like a blade. "You were harvesting me. You treated me like a paycheck, and when the paycheck stopped clearing, you threw me away like trash. You didn't care that I had nowhere to go. You didn't care if the darkness swallowed me whole." I stepped closer until I was towering over them in my heels. Richard looked up at me, his face pale and sweating. He looked small. He looked like a tenant who couldn't pay his rent. "I am the owner now," I said, each word a cold, hard stone. "Every light bulb in this house, every drop of water, every inch of this floor, it belongs to me. And I've done the math, Richard. Your debt is beyond repayment. You've spent 3 years living on my inheritance, my wages, and my pain. The interest has finally eclipsed the principal." "Kate, please," Richard begged, sinking to his knees. "It's cold outside. It's starting to rain again. Where are we supposed to go with $0 to our names?" I looked at the clock on the wall, the one that had timed my shifts and my authorized shower minutes. It was noon. "If you can't pay rent, You don't belong in this house, I said, throwing their own words back at them with a finality that shattered the room. Those were your rules, Linda. I'm just making sure the ledger is balanced. T-Sung stepped forward, his presence a dark, immovable force behind me. He didn't need to say a word. His bodyguards moved with silent, disciplined efficiency, picking up the 2 small bags the Harrisons had managed to pack. Bags filled with cheap, imitation jewelry and worn clothes, because everything of value in the house had already been seized. Your time is up, I said. I watched as they were led to the door. They didn't fight. They didn't have the strength. They walked out onto the porch, the same porch where they had stood and laughed while I collapsed in the mud. As the door began to swing shut, I saw them standing in the drizzle, looking lost and diminished, finally experiencing the real world they had been so eager to teach me about. The deadbolt clicked into place. It was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I turned to T-Sung. He was watching me with a look of quiet, satisfied pride. For the first time, the hospital of silence and the ledger of blood were behind me. I wasn't a victim, and I wasn't just a survivor. I was the architect of the justice that had finally arrived. Is the account settled? T-Sung asked, his voice a low, protective rumble. I looked around my home, my real home, and nodded. Settled in full. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city air smelling of wet asphalt and new beginnings. I stood in the grand office of Kim T-Sung, a room that felt like the center of the world. It was a space defined by dark wood, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The shadows of the past, the ledger of blood, the cold closet, and the sneers of the Harrisons felt 1,000,000 miles away. Here, the only sound was the scratching of a fountain pen against thick, cream-colored parchment. T-Sung sat behind his desk, his tailored suit jacket discarded, his white sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that looked like they were forged from iron. He didn't look up as he signed the final document, his movements precise and final. Beside him stood a man in a judicial robe, a notary whose presence made the transition official in the eyes of the law. It's done, T-Sung said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that filled the room. He slid the folder across the mahogany surface toward me. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the embossed seal. It was the legal guardianship and adoption decree. For 3 years, I had been a ward of the state, a term that really meant I was a piece of property to be traded between foster homes. I had been Kate Johnson, the orphan, Kate Johnson, the tenant, Kate Johnson, the paycheck. But as I looked at the signature of Kim T-Sung, those titles withered and died. The Harrisons were right about one thing, Kate, T-Sung said, standing up and walking toward the window. He looked out over the city he ruled, his hands clasped behind his back. The world is built on debt and power, but they were too small-minded to understand that the greatest power isn't in what you take from people. It's in what you own. He turned to face me, his intense, dark eyes locked onto mine. You no longer owe anyone a cent, not the government, not the NGOs, and certainly not me. This house, the funds we reclaimed, and the protection of my name, it is all yours. You aren't just a girl who survived a storm anymore. You are the heir to everything I've built. I looked down at the papers, then back at him. Why did you do it? You could have just given me the money and sent me on my way. You didn't have to become my guardian. T-Sung stepped closer, his presence warm and immovable. Because I saw myself in you, Kate. I saw someone the world tried to break, someone they thought they could use up and discard. And I wanted to show them that when you try to bury a seed like us, you only make us grow stronger. He reached out, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder, a gesture that carried the weight of a blood oath. You are a Kim now, and in this city, that means no one will ever charge you for the air you breathe again. I felt a tear escape, but it wasn't a tear of grief or exhaustion. It was a tear of release. The heavy, suffocating debt I had carried since my parents died had finally been lifted. I wasn't an orphan anymore. I wasn't a liability. I was a daughter of the most powerful man in the city, and the lessons I had learned in the real world had taught me exactly how to protect what was mine. What do we do now? I asked, my voice finally clear and strong. T-Sung walked to the door, his silent bodyguards falling into step behind him like a physical extension of his will. He paused at the threshold, looking back at me with a rare, faint shadow of a smile, a look of absolute triumph. Now, he said, We show this city that the girl they left in the rain has returned as the storm. We have work to do, Kate. And this time you aren't scrubbing the floors. You're the one deciding who gets to walk on them. I followed him out of the office, the click of my heels echoing against the marble floors like a countdown to a new era. Behind me, the folder lay on the desk, a closed chapter of a tragedy and the first page of a reign. The Harrisons were a fading memory, rotting in the poverty they had so feared. But Kate Kim was a name that would make the city bow. My story was no longer about survival. It was about power. And as I stepped into the elevator beside my new father, I knew that the ledger was finally, perfectly, balanced. As I stood at the window of my new home, looking down at the very streets where I once wandered lost and alone, I realized I wasn't just a survivor. I was the architect of my own fate. The Harrisons are now a memory rotting in the poverty they created for me. But the name Kate Kim, that's a name that makes this city bow. Drop a comment with Team Kate if you believe that what goes around always comes back around. Until next time, remember, never mistake a quiet heart for a weak one. Goodbye, loves.